In my hands, a potion of courage. It gives +5 charisma and +10 to comfort and style. That comes from a leather belt pouch for a flask, which we'll make today by hand. First, a bit of magic, or more precisely, a bit of modern alchemy. Let's test 2 different methods of making leather stamps using 3D printing, with ABS filament and with photopolymer resin. Let's see which of these methods gives the best result for leather embossing. For this test, I'm using vegetable tanned leather, pre-moistened with water. I clamp the leather together with the stamp between 2 boards using clamps. My goal is to understand whether this setup provides enough pressure for proper embossing. This method is especially important to me because I plan to use it outdoors as part of my outdoor Leathercraft challenge. The first stamp, made from ABS plastic, showed that the pressure was slightly insufficient. The impression turned out uneven. The bottle and the outer letters were too shallow. The resin-printed stamp produced sharper lettering. However, the bottle itself still didn't emboss deeply enough. There was also another issue. The square base of the stamp left a visible mark on the leather. This indicates that the relief height of the stamp was not sufficient. In the end, both versions showed that the design needs a bit of refinement, and of course, more pressure. I experimented with different coloring techniques and eventually found one method that allows you to highlight the design cleanly, even without advanced drawing skills. I'll show the full process a bit later. For now, let's move on to the next step, creating the pattern for the leather pouch. First, I make a simple hand-drawn sketch. I'm not much of an artist, but in this case, that doesn't really matter. The main goal is to define the correct size and proportions of the future piece. I also mark the placement of the design right away. It should be centered on the front side of the pouch. At the top, there will be a small strap with a button stud closure. Next, I sketch the belt loop. It can be a simple straight strip, but I add a slight flare toward the top for a more decorative look. It's important to consider the belt width. I'm designing it for a standard 4 cm belt. Then I draw guiding lines from the loop down to the bottom of the pouch. These help define the construction. A strip of leather will run down from the loop, wrap forward, and secure under the bottom of the flask. After that, I move to a vector editor and create a precise pattern based on the flask dimensions. I print it on paper, cut it out, and glue it together. This helps to check if everything fits properly and whether the holes for the rivets align correctly. At this stage, I slightly adjust the shape of the strap and its attachment point. It's very important to take the leather thickness into account when designing the pattern. I'm using vegetable tanned leather with a thickness of 2.5 to 2.8 millimeters. The circumference of my flask is 210 millimeters. I made the main body piece 230 millimeters long, and as it turned out, that's quite tight. The flask fits in very snugly. Next time, I would add a bit more allowance so the flask can be inserted and removed more easily. Once the pattern is ready, I fix it onto the leather using masking tape. Then I punch the holes for the rivets using a round punch. After that, I carefully cut out all the parts along the outline. As you can see, the construction is quite simple, just 3 pieces. This is a project that even a beginner in Leathercraft can handle. Now let's work on finishing the edges of all the pieces. First, I sand the edges to remove any unevenness left from cutting and make them smoother. Next, I round the corners using a corner round punch. After that, I smooth the rounded corners to perfection using a Dremel rotary tool. This speeds up the process significantly, but if you don't have a tool like this, Regular sandpaper will work just fine. It just takes a little more patience, and plus 2 endurance. Next, I bevel the edge of the leather using an edge beveler. This small step makes a big difference in the final look. The edge becomes cleaner and much easier to burnish to a nice shine. I slightly modified the stamp design to make the bottle more raised and the outline more recessed. If you'd like to learn how to create your own leather stamps using AI and 3D printing, I explain the full process in a separate video. You'll find the link in the pop-up card or in the description. And notice that the image on the stamp is mirrored, so the design reads correctly on the leather. Before embossing, I moisten the leather pieces with water. Then I mark a line about 4 millimeters from the edge using a stitch groover. This time I'm using a press for embossing to apply strong and even pressure to the stamp. And the result is really great. The impression turned out deep, sharp, and even. I also decided to decorate the belt loop with an image of 2 crossed axes. For this, I use a metal stamp and a manual press. Now it's time to add some texture to the background. For this, I'm using a mallet and the Sergei Neskromny stamping tool number 37. I really like this pattern. It reminds me of fine gravel or a scatter of stones. First, I stamp along the line that I previously marked with the creaser. This creates a neat border around the edge of the piece. Then, with light taps, I texture the entire background. At the same time, I keep rotating the stamp so the pattern looks more random and natural. I use the same method on the other pieces as well. Near the edge, the texture is deeper and sharper, while closer to the center it becomes softer and less pronounced. And for some reason this reminds me of the spell Stone Skin from my favorite game, Heroes of Might and Magic 3. Yep, as you can probably tell, I'm from the Stone Age, back when strategy games were pixelated and magic felt almost real. Now I'm moving on to the coloring. First, I apply a little Fiebing's Resolene to this empty area on the bottle. This creates a protective layer and prevents unwanted dye from getting where it shouldn't. Now I'll give the Resolene some time to dry. For coloring, I'll use 3 shades to create a smooth gradient: red, mahogany, and chocolate. I'll also need some paper towels to make a simple paint dauber. It needs to have a fairly large and flat surface, so it only colors the top layer of the leather without getting into the small embossed details. I soak the dauber with red dye and press it several times onto a sheet of paper to remove the excess. Then, with light motions, I apply the red dye across the entire surface. As you can see, the embossed design remains untouched. I apply a little more red dye around the edges to cover any missed spots. And I color all the other pieces the same way. Now I move on to the darker color, mahogany. I use the same dauber and again remove the excess on paper. With light strokes, I go over the whole surface, less in the center and more heavily around the edges. You can already see how the darker color brings out the texture. To enhance this effect even more, I add an even darker shade, chocolate. I apply it closer to the edges and use less in the center. This creates a deeper and more dramatic gradient. And finally, I make a dark outline around the edge. For this, I use a wool dauber and the same chocolate dye. On the finished piece, it will look almost black. Looks like my potion of courage is slowly turning into a legendary artifact. Once the dye has fully dried, I apply Prestolin leather oil to protect the leather from drying out. I generously apply the oil with a brush, rub it in slightly, and leave it to dry. For the final finish, I use Resolene. And here I made a small mistake. I applied too much finish directly onto the design, which slightly smeared the dye. It would have been much better to apply the finish with a slightly damp dauber, the same way I applied the dye, or even better, to use an airbrush. But as they say, even alchemists sometimes have side effects. Now I'm burnishing the edges. For this, I apply Tokonoli burnishing gum and polish the edge with an edge slicker until it shines. Now it's time to punch the stitching holes. I take a stitching chisel and a big hammer. Bam! And knock the camera off the tripod. Nice shot. I think I'd better switch to the hand press for punching the holes, to keep the camera safe. Using the press, I carefully punch all the holes. After that, I install the rivets connecting all the parts together. Then I install the button stud and tighten it with a screwdriver. Now I stitch the pouch together with a butt stitch. There are many different ways to make this type of seam. You can use almost any method. It doesn't really matter much, since this seam will be hidden in the end. I stitch both sides of the pouch, gradually tightening the seam along the entire length. Once everything is pulled tight, I tie a double knot and trim the ends of the thread. Then I carefully melt the thread ends to secure the knot. After that, I install the rivets. And the pouch is finished. Now I insert the flask. Fasten the strap. Everything fits perfectly. And I really love the final color and texture. It looks like a fiery vortex surrounded by black smoke, as if this artifact was forged in the heart of a volcano. I fill the flask with Potion of Courage. Skills upgraded. Now I'm ready for battle. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. See you in the next adventure.